So Chris Godwin is gone and Brandon Ayuk with him, but never fear, we've got plenty of cover for you in our Streamers and Stashes show for Week 8 on the Fantasy First Down. Hello and welcome to the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley and welcome to the halfway point of the fantasy regular season. It's week 8 and it's a big week. There's no buys, but there's a lot of injuries going on. So there's plenty to talk about in streamer and stash land. If you haven't already, it'd be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. You can find us on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. If you've got any questions, either hit them in the comments or if you need answered really promptly, you can check us out on our Instagram account. We're also on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and our rankings will be up very soon at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Plus, you can check out my articles over at football.rasball.com. But let's get into today's actions because there's plenty of streaming and stashing to be done. And we're going to start things off, as we always do, with the quarterbacks. And my favorite quarterback of the week, and I signaled this last week when I made him a stash, is Caleb Williams. He was my QB stash for a reason last week. Now is the time to start him as he takes on the Commanders. The rookies had 3 great finishes in the last 4 games, and he takes on an improved, but still a pretty average Commanders defense. With Keenan Allen back, I do think Williams will have plenty of receiving options and a week of preparation to get ready for an important matchup for Chicago. Kirk Cousins is another excellent option. 3 weeks ago, we saw Kirk put 500 yards on the Buccaneers in a shootout of epic proportions. Return fixtures rarely follow the same script, especially with all the injuries happening with the Bucs. But it's hard to deny there's a heap of upside here. So I'm giving the vet one more chance to get things right after what's been a pretty disappointing fortnight of performance in what should have been pretty good matchups for Kirk. Now, if you don't like either of these guys or you just want to plan a little bit for the bye weeks which are coming up, Jameis Winston, obviously, he's taking over for the Browns. There's a bit of a mess during the game where it seems like potentially we might see DTR as the backup, and then they said, oh, that was only strategic, and it's actually Jameis Winston, and maybe they were actually just doing that to protect Watson from the pressure that Winston was putting on. Well, it doesn't matter now. Watson is out, presumably, for the season. Jameis Winston is the guy, and we know that he is the sort of fantasy catnip that we love. He is going to elevate this whole Browns passing game, and I do think he's going to be very good for fantasy. He's been a fantasy gun for the better part of the last decade, but the issue for him has never been fantasy production. It's been eating those W's, and the question is, can he keep the job? Well, we don't need to worry about that. We just need to worry about how he's going to go for fantasy for now. I think in a deeper league, I think it's worth stashing him to see what happens, but there are going to be situations where you are going to want to start him in the coming weeks. Obviously, in Superflex, he's a great pickup, but with waivers having gone through, you're probably going to need to have struck if you're going to get him at this point in time. Let's talk running backs, and Javonte Williams had a big game last week. At the risk of repeating myself, always start your running backs against the Panthers and your kickers and DSTs, actually. So this week, it's Javonte Williams getting the Carolina treatment. Last week, it was 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. This week, arguably even more upside. So I do like Javonte Williams as a great start this week. He'll move in as a running back 2 option and could finish even higher than that. I think he falls in somewhere around that Kareem Hunt region. That's one question that I've had that I've struggled with. Kareem Hunt versus Javonte Williams. Both have good matchups, but Williams definitely has the better. You should know to start Kareem Hunt, by the way. That's why he's not in my streamers article. Rashad White gets the matchup against the Falcons, and there's not very good running backs this week. There's not many that wouldn't normally be starting that you should be starting this week, but I think White is one. The Buccaneers lent heavily on their running backs once Mike Evans and Chris Godwin were out against the Ravens. Now, the Falcons do get a tough matchup this week, but last week was a tough matchup against the Ravens, and Rashad White still had a massive week. He was a top 3 running back. So I do think heavy usage is very possible as their primary receiving back. I certainly have him ahead of Bucky Irving, and that's not true of many people at the moment. So there's sneaky upside here. And another deeper stream, and I really don't like this option, but I do think with Tua Tagovailoa coming back in the matchup against the Cards, you could start Raheem Mostert. We know that Devon Achane remains the clear lead back in Miami, but Raheem Mostert's still getting plenty of touches and plenty of goal line looks as well. The Cardinals are a good running back matchup, and I do think the return of Tua is going to make this a more functional offense and see more points. So if you're looking for a real bottom of the barrel option, he might even be available off waivers in your league, then I do think Mostert is a guy that you could start. Now, let's talk about where the money's made, and that's with stashes. Most of you are going to have your starters for this week, but it is all about stashing running backs in fantasy. This is where fantasy seasons are won and lost. My favorite stash at the moment is Alexander Mattison, who surprisingly retained his lead back role, even with Zamir White coming back, and looked pretty darn good. This is especially surprising, given he nearly lost it to Amir Abdullah a couple of weeks ago in the fourth quarter. They just basically decided to turn to Abdullah, and he looked pretty good. And then they randomly get back to Madison again. Madison looks really good against the Rams. He gets a tough matchup against the Chiefs this week, and you just basically can't start him this week. But I do think he's going to be a solid bye-week filler if you've lost one of your normal running backs or traded them away or something like that. I do think Madison's someone you can pick up and use. He lacks the upside of a lot of the top guys, but still a very good option. Now, if you're looking for handcuffs, Braylon Allen and Blake Corum are two of my favorites. You have to feel like if you get an injury to Breece Hall or an injury to Kyron Williams, all of a sudden you've got a potential league winner, and that's what I'm looking for in my handcuffs. I don't care what they're doing for me now. I care about what could happen with an injury in front of them. So my favorite handcuffs are Allen and Corum, but I also really like Zach Charbonnet, Tyler Algier, Ray Davis. Tank Bigsby's a solid option who can actually give you points at the moment. Tyron Tracy in that same category where he can give you points now but lacks the same upside. Kamani Vidal's okay. Antonio Gibson, we know will start if there's an injury. Ty Chandler in that same category. Although Cam Akers coming in, it makes me a little bit nervous for him. Damian Pierce is technically the backup in Houston, but will only get the early downs work. Roshan Johnson, the backup, I do think he has some upside there. Justice Hill, with Keaton Mitchell coming back, that makes me nervous, which is why he's low down. And Trey Benson, I expect, will probably get more touches as the season goes on. It looked like he started to get touches last week, but then it was all James Conner in week 7. So week 6 was a little bit of Benson. Suddenly it's back to Conner. I'm not trusting anything better out of him in the near future. Let's talk wide receivers. And it's been a while since I've said this name in a positive light, but it is Jalen Waddle. And this is really just more of a public service announcement that Tua Tagovailoa is back. And that means that even though I'm having people ask me, should you be dropping Jalen Waddle? No. You picked him up because you thought he was going to be a top 12, top 24 wide receiver, and Tua's back. Why would you drop him? No, don't drop him. This is the guy who put up 100 yards in week 1. This is the guy who's had 3 straight 1,000-yard seasons with Tua. So he's going to return to wide receiver 2 starters. We don't know exactly how good he's going to be, but with Tua back, I do think he's someone that you absolutely have to start this week against the Cardinals in what should be a good game for Miami. We'll see how he goes from here and then adjust. Juwan Jennings, I mean, look, obviously would have rushed to the waiver wire. His health's a real question here. We don't even know if he's going to be playing, but if he is, Cowboys is a solid matchup. It does appear that Brandon Ayuk's out for the season. We don't know if Debo's going to be back either with pneumonia, so that does open up an opportunity for Jennings in particular this week to shine if both of those guys are out, but we need him to be healthy first. And Ricky Pearsall coming back will tamper expectations. We saw what happened when both Ayuk and Debo were out in week 3 when he put up 175 yards and 3 touchdowns for Juwan Jennings, but he's far less of a guarantee than that. I do think he's a solid streamer this week if he's healthy, but I do think his upside is cut. And probably my favorite option of all the streamers is someone not many people have been thinking about. It's Jerry Jeudy and Cedric Tillman, who I haven't got on the graphic here. They take on the Ravens. It's a fantastic matchup. It talked about how good Jameis Winston is for his receivers. He's willing to put the ball into tight windows and take risks. That generally hurts him, but it doesn't hurt the receivers. It's more likely to hurt the team as a whole because he'll give away a lot of turnovers, and then we'll have to keep chasing the game. So I do think Jeudy and Tillman should be very good. Massive boom bust, really. There is a possibility that both of these guys really struggle, or one of them struggles and the other one's very good. So while they're risky, the Ravens secondary has considered the second most points to wide receivers this season, or to outside wide receivers anyway. So assuming that Jameis Winston is starting, I do really like Jeudy and Tillman. Now, let's talk stashes, and we're going back to the 49ers, and Ricky Pearsall is a solid option, but until we know what that 49ers receiver room is going to look like with Brandon Ayuk out, I'm not really willing to start Ricky Pearsall yet. He did look like he was going to be the guy that comes in and is productive, but I don't know. I think he's more of a stash right now, and then we'll see what happens, especially when Debo is back. If Debo's not back this week, and especially if Jennings isn't healthy, then all of a sudden you can definitely start Pearsall. But I don't know. If we have both Debo and Jennings back, all of a sudden I think I'm probably waiting on Pearsall. Jalen McMillan, arguably the number one now, with Mike Evans temporarily out with a hamstring issue and Chris Godwin very sadly out for the season with that dislocated ankle. I do think McMillan's probably the number one. He was the first guy to come on. He was starting even when those two guys were playing. It was then Trey Palmer that came on and then Sterling Shepard. So even though Shepard's been the main guy for a while, McMillan and Palmer were injured. That's why Shepard was getting a lot of touches. I do think McMillan is the number one guy. He's even been mentioned by the coach as being the number one guy. So I do have a feeling this offense might just suck without Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. And I also think it's possible that the wide receiver one, who was previously a wide receiver three, might just not be very productive if the offense is sucking. Think about Trey Turner, for reference, for example, who became the wide receiver one and then still didn't do very much. Of course, sometimes that player does do something. Think Juwan Jennings in week 3, for example. So I would stash Jalen McMillan just to see what happens. Sterling Shepard's an option, so is Trey Palmer, but I do think it's probably going to be McMillan that is the main guy. But I do think we'll see a lot of Kate Otten, who we'll see later, and a lot of the running backs in the passing game as well. Now, Rashad Bateman, shockingly, wide receiver 2 last week and wide receiver 22 on the season. Now, that seems surprising, but remember, he was looking pretty good through his sophomore season a couple of years ago. It's been very boom bust for a while, but Lamar Jackson's been passing the ball more often. I do think he's a good bye week filler because he's got massive upside, but I don't know that I want to start him this week. Let's talk about tight ends. And gosh, I've talked so much about David Njoku. It should be obvious that you need to start him, but I made him a stash last week because we needed to see what happened. And that injury to Deshaun Watson really helped him. But I think even before that, it was clearly looking like he's the number one guy here, with Amari Cooper being traded out of town as well. So last week he had 14 targets. I do think he's going to have other big weeks as well. They're not always going to pass that much, but he's a guy that you just have to be starting if you have him on your roster, and hopefully you do. There's still a couple of leagues out there where he's available, which is crazy to me. Definitely go and pick up David Njoku if he's there, but start him if you have him, unless you have one of those top few starts. We're talking guys like McBride, Kittle, maybe Kelsey, definitely Bowers. You would start over him. Now, Kate Otten's a good option for this week. Evans out, Godwin out. Baker Mayfield turned to his running backs in Kate Otten last week when that happened. Otten ran a lot of routes every single week of this season, but in the last couple of weeks, they've started to be productive. And with those top two guys out, he turned his routes into 10 targets for 8 receptions and 100 yards. Great streaming option, at least until Evans is back and probably beyond. He's someone I really like. Finally, Taysom Hill is a stash option. We've seen he can be very productive. There's going to be some tight ends on buys very soon. I think Hill is an option for you. I'd much rather him than someone like a Mark Andrews, for example, because while Andrews has a little bit of upside, I think Hill has a little bit more, and neither has any floor at all. The Saints badly lack weapons. Taysom's likely returning this week. I would stash him still just to see exactly what his role looks like. But especially if Derek Carr keeps missing games, all of a sudden Hill could be very productive. And he is a viable starter this week. I just don't really want to risk it with him until we know what's going to happen. Now let's talk kickers very briefly. Will Lutz, I said it earlier, I'll say it again. Star kickers facing the Panthers. And as a bonus, Will Lutz currently the top 5 kicker on the season. And Will Reichert against the Rams. He's been very accurate. He hasn't missed a field goal. He's got 12 field goals, and he hasn't missed an extra point. He's got 18 of them as well, 13 from 30 overall, including some longer ones too. So he gets a good matchup against the Rams. Should be another solid performer. I do think he's going to really improve as the season goes on as a kicker. And finally, DSTs. Chiefs haven't been good so far this season, but I don't know. Just trust me here. Apparently, I'm ranking DSTs really accurately this season. And the Chiefs have an elite defense. They're taking on a backup, I guess, Gardner Minshew, even though it's the starter at the start of the season. Realistically, it's not starting for most teams. The Raiders' offense has just generally been terrible. They've conceded the second most DST points this season. They might have Jacoby Myers back, but they don't have Devontae Adams anymore. I do think they're going to really struggle. I do think the Chiefs should be productive. And the Packers, they've been the surprise packet from DST land this season, making up for some very inconsistent play by Jordan Love. They're the number 3 DST on the season. And they get the Jags this week, who oddly isn't the greatest matchup. Jacksonville's not had a good record, but they haven't given away a lot of turnovers or given up too many sacks. So I do still like the Packers, though. I do think, regardless of that matchup, in their few tough games, the Jags offense has struggled. They've just had easier matchups like the Patriots and the Colts, which has made them look like they're more capable than they are. I think against the Packers might get a lot of sacks and quite a few turnovers here. And they definitely always have touchdown upside. And that's all we've got for our streamer and stash show for week 10. As always, it would be great if you could like and subscribe. It really helps us out as we try to get to the point where we can monetize this. I'm on Instagram. You can follow me at the Fantasy First Down. You can ask questions there or here. Twitter, we're at Fantasy First Down with no O. Articles will be out very soon at football.rasball.com, and our rankings probably out by the time you're watching this at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Hope you enjoy another fantastic week of football this week, and I'll be back in a couple of days' time for the Start Sit show. That should come out sometime on Saturday. I look forward to talking to you then.